Happy New Year, folks! J. Scott Phillips here, and welcome to my channel. Today, we are bound for the far future with Clifford D. Simak's first ever published story, The World of the Red Sun. Now, several months ago when I first started this channel, I decided to do a little series on the golden age of science fiction, and I thought that I would kind of focus each video on a significant moment or author or story that had some impact on science fiction moving forward from the golden age. But I did one video for Isaac Asimov, which fell a little bit out of that range because he had published a couple of minor short stories before the actual advent of the golden age of science fiction, which is kind of a line in the sand that has become kind of accepted as beginning with the July 1939 issue of Astounding Stories. Now that's kind of generally accepted, but it's a little gray area. So I went back and did a little video on Isaac Asimov's first couple of stories, and then into what is accepted as the beginning of the golden age of science fiction, and then have moved on from there. However, even more than Isaac Asimov, there are several science fiction authors that got their start some years before the golden age of science fiction, and they're significant enough that I feel like I should go back and kind of touch on some of those. And in this video, I'm going to talk about Clifford D. Simak and his debut into the realm of science fiction. Clifford D. Simak is a pretty important name in the annals of science fiction. During his career, he won no less than 3 Hugos and 2 Nebulas, and a few other awards that are probably lesser known. He was voted as the 3rd Grand Master by the Science Fiction Writers of America, and often wrote of the distant future of the Earth, the fate of the Earth, and is what is typically described as pastoral or rural settings, often populated by robots, dogs, and a few surviving humans here and there. But he is well known for probably Way Station, one of his major novels, his fix-up novel, City, and one of my favorites, A Choice of Gods, which I first got when I was first starting to collect science fiction back in around 1973. I think A Choice of Gods came out in 1972, and I first bought the science fiction book club edition of that back in 73 probably, when I was in high school, and loved that book and have enjoyed Clifford D. Simak's work ever since. Simak was born in 1904 in rural Wisconsin, and he grew up with the grand tradition of the family reading circle. His mother or father would often gather the family around and read books and newspapers to Clifford and his little brother Carson. And Simak remembered at one time that when he was 5 years old, his mother had been reading him stories from all around the world in the newspaper, and he asked his mother if those stories were true. And of course she said yes, and from that moment on, he wanted to be a newspaper man. And in his early 20s, he got his first newspaper job at the Iron River Reporter in Michigan. At the time, he was a big fan of H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, and Edgar Rice Burroughs, which, for a would-be science fiction writer, is already a pretty good pedigree to start out with. And being a newspaper man, he already loved to write, so he thought he would try his hand at writing some science fiction. And in 1931, he wrote his first short story, The Cubes of Ganymede. And he sent that off to Amazing Stories, and didn't hear back right away. So he continued to write his second short story, The World of the Red Sun, which is what we're going to talk about today, his first published story. He sent that off to Astounding Stories, and this was years before the John W. Campbell era, but they rejected it, and the manuscript was sent back to him. So he took that and resubmitted it, this time to Hugo Gernsback's new Wonder Stories, which was accepted and was printed for the first time, his first published story appeared in the Wonder Stories issue of December 1931. The World of the Red Sun owes a lot to H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, which was a big influence on Simak. But Simak's story was about two young scientists who invent a time machine. And interesting, because when I've read The Time Machine, and you may have thought this too, is that H.G. Wells' Time Machine might have had a few problems in that it traveled through time but not space. So who knows what's going to be in that space at some point in the past or the future when it arrives there, if there's going to be a building or a mountain or a valley or something, not the same level ground with no obstructions when the machine suddenly appears out of time. Simak kind of solved for that in that his two young scientists, Harl and Bill, their names are, designed their time machine inside an airplane so that it can fly when they reappear out of time. They're not going to be caught inside of a mountain or whatever might be going on the ground, and then also be able to travel around in space somewhat once they arrive, or make an escape if they need to. And not only that, they design it so that it can withstand the environment of time travel. It's going to be absolute zero outside. There's going to be no air or air pressure outside. There's no gravity. Things like that, these two scientists, Harl and Bill, have solved for. The one thing they didn't solve for, though, is their instrument readings. They think they're going about 5,000 years into the future, and as they're traveling, they spend only 15 minutes in the machine traveling into the future. But when they arrive, one thing I guess I should mention is it starts off in 1935, a few years before the story was published, in Denver, Colorado. So when they launch their time voyage, they are flying over the skies of Denver, 1935. So when they come out of time, as I mentioned, their instruments aren't quite accurate. They find themselves tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or maybe even millions of years in the future. So when they come out into that distant future, there is nothing but ruins of the city of Denver below them. And to the east, there's just a vast ocean stretching off to the horizon. So things have changed a little bit. And so they find a place to land. It's all desert now around the ancient city of Denver. And there's a huge, giant, bloated red sun in the sky. So obviously a lot of time has passed. Now, they land the plane, and as soon as they land, they notice off in the distance hordes of men rushing at them. And these men are dressed in nothing but furs and loincloths, those kinds of things. So there has been some kind of degeneration happening over the years. But fortunately, they still speak English. So they are captured. They're able to fight off and kill a few of the hordes because they brought along a couple of 45s, a couple of guns to protect themselves. But they're just so overwhelmed that they are captured, and they're hauled back into the ruins of ancient Denver to this big arena. And they are told they are going to be thrown into the arena to fight the minions of Golan Kurt, who was some kind of an alien mastermind creature that came out of the cosmos some 5 million years earlier and conquered mankind with some kind of mind control. So they're thrown out into the arena, and they still have their 245s for some reason. Golan Kurt thought that would make the games more interesting. But from what Harl and Bill have learned or have deduced, they kind of figure out what Golan Kurt really is. Now, there's no explanation in the story as to how they figure this out, but they have some idea that they start to act on, that Golan Kurt isn't really quite what is claimed to be. And they usurp that assumption and manage to fight Golinkurt off and actually defeat him, which then frees all the enslaved people, all the minions of Golinkurt, and kind of save the planet. Now, one of the things that this kind of reminds me of the Gamesters of Triskelion from the original series of Star Trek, as well as a lot of other episodes of Star Trek, in that this is the world of the Red Sun, but somehow the entire world is only localized in around the vicinity of Denver, the future ruins of Denver. We don't know what's going on the rest of the world of the Red Sun, but apparently nothing too important. Everything happens just right there, and the one big bad is defeated, and that seems to save the world. Now, having been written in 1931, the story does have a lot of things that you would expect from a story back in those days. Pretty standard early science fiction fare. Things like the scientists having invented some fantastic machine, a far-flung future Earth that has degenerated almost back to the Stone Age, an alien creature mastermind that is all-powerful to all supposition, and just things like that. But one thing that, I guess I should say, even with all those, I think to be fair to the story, those things probably were not so overused at the time that Simak wrote it, that he still wrote a pretty riveting story, even with all those kinds of things that we would now expect. But the one thing that, to me, even to this day, was kind of surprised me was his ending. Which was not expected. I don't think you would see many endings like this to stories back in the day, or even maybe today. Now, I won't give it away at all, other than what I've already talked about as far as the setup of the story itself. And I won't say it's a twist ending, but it leaves the reader, at least it left me, with a sense of awe and wonder that I think if it had gone in more traditional type of ending, it still would have been a fun story and perfectly enjoyable, but it really left me with something other to ponder, and you should check it out. That and the fact that aside from the two handguns that Harl and Bill took along with them, they also thought enough to bring plenty of cigarettes with them, so they were never without a smoke during the story. Now, this would not be little Scotty Phillips's BookTube channel if we didn't now talk about some artwork. And this short story was first published in the Wonder Stories issue back in 1931, the December 31 issue, and has been collected in a lot of anthologies and collections since, but I don't believe has ever had any other illustration. It did not make the cover illustration of that magazine, being Simak's very first story. He wasn't a known name at all yet. But it did have an interior illustration by none other than Frank R. Paul. This is the title page from the story, and Paul is showing us a scene in the arena where our time travelers, Harl and Bill, are fighting Golinkurt, who is described in the story as being this kind of disembodied brain with that's 2 feet across, that has this tiny little atrophied face tucked below it, and it's encased in a protective glass bubble that can then float above them. And here they're firing their trusty 45s at them. But this is kind of why it's reminiscent to me of the Gamesters of Triskelion, that old original series Star Trek episode where we have the giant brain who is running these barbaric battles in an arena just purely for his own amusement. Now, we can nitpick this a little bit, which, of course, I love to do. We see that this brain, which is supposedly 2 feet across, looks much larger here. So there's a little creative license there, and I think it works okay for creative license sake. But then the crumbled ruins of Denver in the background seem to be pretty modern skyscrapers towering well above the arena. And I'm not sure that's quite true to the story, but Frank R. Paul here is the illustrator. He may be kind of going for more of a futuristic look Then there's that, looks like a big old moon up there, but that's got to be the red sun. The moon is never mentioned in the story. Now, I usually like to talk about the background of the artists that we examine on my channel here. But I think that Frank R. Paul is such a significant contributor to the genre as far as artwork goes that he probably deserves a video at some point just on his own. But for now, it's just suffice to say that I think he is really the grandfather of science fiction illustrators, and he was definitely Hugo Gernsback's go-to guy for a lot of reasons. They had a big history together. So for now, I'll just show a few examples of some of his most remarkable work to get a sense of his contribution. Starting on the left here is the August 1928 cover for Amazing Stories. And Paul is depicting here a scene from E. Doc Smith's The Skylark of Space, which began its serialization in this issue. This same issue had the very first ever Buck Rogers story, Armageddon 2419 AD, and a lot of people who see this cover, which is pretty iconic nowadays, they think that that's Buck Rogers on the cover, but it's not. It's actually from The Skylark of Space. Just coincidentally, Buck Rogers happened to be in the same issue and is often depicted with that same sort of an outfit. But moving on to the next one over, the August 1929 issue of Wonder Stories, Paul is credited here with being the first ever to illustrate a space station. So that's kind of a significant issue. And then a few months later, moving over to the next one here, the November 1929 issue of Wonder Stories is the first depiction of a flying saucer. And that was by Frank R. Paul, almost 20 years before the Roswell incident, which is supposedly where we first heard of flying saucers. Paul was already illustrating them a couple of decades earlier. And then on the far right, there is the October 1939 #1 issue of Marvel Comics featuring the birth of the original Human Torch. So those are just a few things that Frank R. Paul is known and credited for. So I think you can see that at some point it's probably worthwhile to do a separate video just on covering his story and other examples of his artwork. Very significant to the genre. And that pretty much covers The World of the Red Sun, Clifford D. Simak's first ever published story in December of 1931. But whatever happened, you might ask, to that first story he wrote, The Cubes of Ganymede, that he sent off to T. O'Connor Sloan, editor of Amazing Stories, earlier in 1931. And as I said earlier, he had not heard back from Amazing by the time he wrote World of the Red Sun. And it wasn't until 1933, 2 years later, that he did get some kind of wind of it in a completely different publication, Science Fiction Digest, which published a list of stories that had been accepted by Amazing for publication. Didn't say when it was going to be published, but it did make that list, so he was looking forward to that. But then 2 more years go by, and in 1935, Simak received a package in the mail, and it was his manuscript with a big crease right down the middle of it, where Sloan had been sitting on it for 4 years with a note that said, "Sorry, the story is a little bit out of date for our purposes." So it's at that point, the manuscript has kind of disappeared and has, to my knowledge, never been published since. I don't believe it has. But if you can find it, it would be might be worth reading and see if that crease still appears on top of it. And so there you have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this New Year's review of Clifford D. Simak's first ever published story, The World of the Red Sun. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did putting it together. It was a lot of fun looking at the artwork again, and kind of looking forward to doing a video on Frank R. Paul, important illustrator. And probably going to be doing some other illustrator-based videos in the coming year here. So hope you stay tuned for those. And in the meantime, Happy New Year, and thanks for watching. Thanks a lot.